Dubro Suspicion Files.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking an investigation that it really sits at this wild intersection of geology, political trauma, and what is, for all intents and purposes, a genuine ghost story.
It's a huge one.
It is. We are diving into one of the most powerful and, I think, enduring legends in modern Korean history, the story of the Iron Stakes.
Right, these iron rods supposedly driven deep into the nation's sacred mountains.
And this isn't just folklore, is it? This is a narrative that's woven so tightly into the national consciousness that it goes way beyond that.
Oh, absolutely. For many people, it offers a tangible physical explanation for decades of really profound national suffering.
So what's the core allegation here that we're exploring?
The core of it is that Imperial Japan, during its 35-year occupation, employed this secret dark strategy. It wasn't just military control. It wasn't just administrative.
So it was spiritual warfare.
Exactly. That's the term for it. Spiritual warfare.
And that's right. Because when we talk about Korea, you have to understand, we aren't just talking about a chunk of rock and soil on a map.
No.
In the collective imagination, the peninsula is often seen as this massive, powerful animal, a crouching tiger usually. It's a living, breathing entity.
And the anxiety, the trauma that we're talking about, it all centers on the belief that Japan tried to sever that tiger's life force.
To kill it.
To kill it, or at least to cripple it permanently.
Yeah.
So we're really analyzing this profound conflict between, belief on one hand and bureaucracy on the other.
Right.
The central accusation is that the Japanese administration systematically drove these heavy iron rods into the nation's hale.
Which are its vital energy points.
The vital points, yeah. To perform something called dimak, which literally means severing the vein.
Wow.
And the goal, allegedly, was to permanently subjugate the spirit of Korean resistance, to prevent great leaders from ever being born again, and, at the end of the day, to ensure Korea's eternal obedience.
So these stakes become these incredibly potent, rusted symbols of national violation, of trauma.
They do. And so our mission in this deep dive is really to untangle two very different realities that our sources present. On one side, you have this incredibly compelling, traumatic narrative of the colonial curse.
And anything else.
On the other, you have the mundane, technical, almost boring reality of the cartographic imperative.
The need to make a map.
The need to make a map. We're looking at how these standard rational technologies of rule, things like survey markers, military anchors, were received and then ultimately reinterpreted through this intense lens of trauma as technologies of curse.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can even begin to appreciate the magnitude of the crime they're alleging, we need to understand the victim.
The land itself.
The land itself. Why would a simple piece of rusted iron become a national obsession? I think we have to first grasp this concept of the nation's spiritual anatomy.
To really get the psychological weight of these iron stakes, you have to immerse yourself in the indigenous Korean worldview, which is called Pongsujiri.
Which gets translated as Korean Feng Shui, but that's a bit of an oversimplification, isn't it?
A massive one. It's so much more than just where you put your sofa. It's a whole cosmological system.
Yeah.
It translates as wind and water, and it dictates, human life and destiny based on the harmonious flow of natural energy.
And this contrast with the Western view of geography it's just critical to get this. For most of us, a mountain is a geological feature. It's separate from spirituality.
Right. But here, the land is infused with life. It's a somatic entity.
Somatic, meaning like a body.
Exactly, like a body. It has a circulatory system of life energy, which is called ki. Mountains are seen as these huge, dragon-like conduits for this energy, and rivers are what define its flow.
So the landscape isn't just a passive backdrop for human events.
Not at all. It's an active participant in human fate. So, logically, if you damage the land, you are directly damaging the destiny of the people who live on it.
And the most critical physical expression of this idea, the actual backbone of the nation, is the Baekdudaegan.
The national spine, that's what it's called. It's this continuous central mountain range of the peninsula. It starts way up at Mount Baekdu in the north and runs for thousands of kilometers south all the way to Jiri Mountain.
Physically, it's a watershed.
Physically, it defines the drainage basins, yes. But spiritually, it is the most important channel for Qi. It's the ancestral energy flowing from the sacred north down towards the southern seas.
And the sources really highlight its symbolic importance as an unbroken line, right?
That's the absolute essence of it. Unlike, Western geological classifications that might break up a range based on fault lines or valleys, the 𝐏𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 is defined by this philosophical insistence that the ridgeline never fully crosses water.
An unbroken chain.
It symbolizes national integrity, continuity, this organic wholeness that cannot and should not be severed.
So the concept is crystal clear.
Yeah.
If the nation has a spine, an injury to that spine is catastrophic.
Right.
It's not just a wound, it's paralysis. It cripples the nation's ability to realize its destiny. The imagery is just so visceral.
It is, and it transforms any simple physical disruption into this catastrophic spiritual violation. And if the 𝐏𝐃𝐂𝐃𝐒𝐓 is the spine, then we have to look at the land's acupuncture points.
The specific nodes where all that energy concentrates.
Precisely. These are the 𝐏𝐼, or the acupuncture points. And when they are particularly auspicious, they're called myeongdaeng.
And these are actual places.
Oh, yeah. Specific mountain peaks, prominent rock formations, saddles between hills. These are sites where the 𝐼 is most concentrated and beneficial. And traditionally, if you place a home, or more importantly, an ancestral grave, on a myeongdaeng.
Grave placement is huge in Bungsu, right?
Incredibly sensitive. Doing it right ensures enormous prosperity, health, and the rise of great descendants for centuries.
So logically, the reverse must be true, piercing one of those nodes.
Exactly. To drive an iron stake into a 𝐼 is the ultimate act of spiritual sabotage. You're not just stopping the flow of energy to one small area, you're potentially causing a widespread spiritual hemorrhage that affects the whole nation.
And the specific fear was about leadership.
That was a major part of it, yes. The belief was that it would cripple Korea's ability to produce independent, strong leaders.
It sounds like a really strategic, targeted attack, not just random vandalism. It implies the colonizers had to have a sophisticated understanding of Pungsujiri to use it against the people.
And that is the absolute core tenet of the 𝐏𝐿𝐴𝐶 legend.
𝐏𝐿𝐴𝐶, severing the vein.
The myth says that the Japanese colonial administration, because they understood how deep this belief system ran and because they feared Korean resilience, they hired or even forced highly knowledgeable geomancers to pinpoint these exact vital points.
So they had inside help, basically.
That's the belief. And the stakes were then driven into the most sensitive areas, the peaks, or what are called the wastes, these narrow passes, where the dragon's energy is believed to condense, specifically to cut that Qi flow.
And this belief, it offers such a compelling retroactive explanation for all the immense national suffering that came after the occupation.
It's a perfect narrative container for Han. That sense of unresolved grief we'll get into later. I mean, why was Korea brutally divided in 1945?
Right. Why the devastating Korean War? Why decades of military dictatorships?
Through the lens of 𝐏𝐿𝐴𝐶, the answer becomes simple. It wasn't just geopolitics or economic failure. It was the blocked meridians of the national body. The iron stake gives you a perfect, tangible object to blame for all this intangible generational suffering.
This anxiety was also expressed in how the very shape of the country was seen. You mentioned the tiger versus the rabbit.
Yes, this is cartographic anxiety made physical. Historically, Korean nationalists saw the peninsula's shape as a powerful, crouching tiger ready to spring onto the Asian continent.
A symbol of power.
A huge symbol of power and potential. But Japanese colonial geographers, in an effort to diminish Korea's perceived strength, often drew it differently. They depicted it as a passive, small, prey-like rabbit attached to the mainland.
And the stakes fit into that imagery.
Perfectly. According to the legend, the stakes were driven into the tiger's most vulnerable points, its waist or its neck, to permanently domesticate it, to strip it of its powerful identity and symbolically render it forever a passive rabbit.
So 𝐏𝐿𝐴𝐶 becomes the ultimate colonial strategy in the minds of the people. A systematic, almost magical effort to use Korea's own spiritual knowledge against itself.
Turning this powerful national symbol into weakened, passive prey through an act of metaphysical warfare, that's the curse narrative. Okay, so now we have to shift our perspective completely. We have to move from that sacred, living landscape to the cold, hard, mundane reality of colonial administration.
Right. If the Korean perspective was somatic and spiritual, the Japanese colonial gaze was what?
Utterly technocratic, rational, and maybe above all else, extractive.
The Japanese occupation, which started in 1910, it wasn't just about military control. It was about total integration into the imperial economic and legal system.
Exactly.
And I guess the old adage is true, you can't tax what you can't measure.
That's precisely it. The need for precise control, for rendering the entire peninsula legible, quantifiable, and taxable, it necessitated a massive infrastructure project, the Imperial Land Survey.
Which was formally done between 1910 and 1918.
Yes, and this was one of the most ambitious mapping projects in all of Asian history.
Give us a sense of the scale here. I mean, we're not talking about a small team with a couple of tripods.
Not at all. The Bureau of Land Survey, the Rinji Tochichosakyoku, employed thousands of personnel. These people were often working in treacherous conditions for years. The amount of human and financial capital they invested was staggering.
And the goal was what, exactly?
It was twofold. First, measure every single parcel of land to establish either state ownership or clear private title. And second, use that data to calculate equitable tax rates.
Which, of course, overwhelmingly benefited the colonial administration and Japanese migrants.
Of course. And to achieve any of that, they needed the absolute foundation of accurate mapping, a geodetic grid.
The reference network.
Correct. Before you can map a single rice paddy, you have to create a fixed, highly reliable network of control points. This meant establishing thousands of triangulation points for horizontal coordinates and benchmarks for vertical elevation.
And these points had to be permanent. They couldn't just be wooden stakes.
No, they had to be permanent, fixed markers that surveyors could rely on for decades to come.
Let's get into the hierarchy of those markers, because this seems to be where the mundane requirements of the job crash right into the sacred landscape.
It is. The highest level was the Class 1 primary geodetic framework. These were the most critical points, spaced roughly 40 to 50 kilometers apart.
And where did they have to put them?
They had to be placed on the highest, most geographically prominent peaks. There was no other choice.
To get the longest possible sight lines.
Exactly. Sometimes they needed visibility between markers hundreds of miles away. It's how you link the entire peninsula into one coherent, accurate coordinate system.
So the spots they chose were, just by technical necessity, the very same high peaks that were already considered sacred Hayol by local tradition.
That's the bitter, bitter irony of it all. The markers themselves had to be incredibly robust. They were often large, expensive granite stones, some weighing hundreds of pounds. But the marker also required an iron bolt or rod drilled directly into the bedrock to establish a precise, non-moving center point for their instrument, the theodolite.
And drilling into bedrock, which is common on Korean mountaintops, right? Hard, solid rock. That presents a real technical challenge. You can't just stick it in the ground.
Absolutely not. The need for permanence demanded industrial methods. The survey teams had to drill into the summit rock and insert these robust, non-corrosive markers.
How did they secure them?
The sources confirmed they used materials like molten sulfur or high-quality concrete to make sure that they wouldn't shift due to weather or seismic activity or even human interference for 50 or 100 years.
So this technical requirement, drilling an iron anchor into the highest, hardest rock, that's the physical reality that underpins the whole spiritual accusation.
It is, and that detail about securing the bolts is crucial. It explains why decades later, during the 1990s removal campaign, these things were so incredibly difficult to get out. They weren't just nails, they were engineered anchors.
And then below Class 1.
Then you move down the hierarchy to Class 2 and 3 points. They're spaced closer together, maybe 4 to 25 kilometers apart. These might use smaller stone or concrete posts, and sometimes just simpler iron stakes.
Yeah.
But they all serve the exact same function: measurement, control, and standardization.
So this sets the perfect stage for what you call the collision of intent versus interpretation.
Yes.
A technical act done for bureaucratic control is interpreted as this act of spiritual annihilation.
Just imagine the scene. A Japanese survey team arrives. They're speaking a language nobody understands. They're using these terrifyingly advanced instruments, theodolites, levels, drilling gear.
Right.
They select a spot, maybe a centuries-old prayer site or a known heol. They drill a hole, smash in an iron rod, pour in the sulfur or concrete, and secure a metal cap.
The Japanese intent is just cold administrative efficiency.
Exactly. They're establishing a baseline for a 1.50 thousand a feeder so they can facilitate land seizure and taxation. It's a job.
But the Korean interpretation is immediate and profoundly personal. They're driving a metal spike into the head of the mountain spirit, killing the energy of land, killing the luck of the entire community.
The violence might be bureaucratic in its intent, but its effect on the ground is perceived as total spiritual devastation.
And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. This spiritual rewriting was reinforced by other policies like toponymic violence.
Yes, the colonial government wasn't just measuring the land, they were renaming it.
Systematically replacing indigenous names.
That's right. They actively suppressed or replaced these beautiful, descriptive geomantic place names like Dragon Head Mountain or Five Generals Peak with generic Japanese pronunciations or simple numbers or bland labels like North Peak 3.
So that act of renaming would have just confirmed to the local population that this survey was, in fact, an act of violation.
It confirmed their worst fears, that it was about stripping the landscape of its deep spiritual identity and replacing it with sterile colonial control.
So in any narrative that involves a big conspiracy, there's always a mastermind, right? The person who holds the secret map. In the Iron Stake myth, that role often falls to this figure, Murayama Jejun.
Yeah. He was born in 1891, and he's one of the most fascinating and frankly problematic figures of the colonial era.
What was his background? He wasn't an engineer or a surveyor?
No, he was a sociology graduate. He worked directly for the government general of Korea from 1919 all the way to 1941, and his job was ethnography and social customs.
His job was basically cultural surveillance. He was gathering intelligence on the spiritual and daily life of the colonized people.
That's a perfect way to put it. His body of work is enormous. He chronicled everything from funeral rites to local festivals. But crucially for our story, he produced these extensive works like Joseoni Pongsu, the Feng Shui of Joseon, and the Ghosts of Joseon.
So he was literally mapping the spiritual anatomy of the country.
Meticulously, documenting local legends, the locations of Yeongdang sites, the specific concerns people had about their graves and energy flows.
And this is where the nationalist myth really takes root. It sees his work as the ultimate reconnaissance mission. He provided the target list.
That is the enduring accusation, that Murayama was the intelligence officer for this spiritual war, that he located all the sacred Myeongdang, all the vital points that needed protection, specifically so the Japanese administration could dispatch their Iron Stake squads to carry out the 𝐏𝐻𝐃 strategy.
So he drew the blueprint for the metaphysical attack.
In that version of the story, yes. But the historical reality of colonial intent, while it's still incredibly insidious, it paints a very different picture of what he and his bosses thought they were doing.
His intent wasn't magical. It was. What?
It was rooted in a kind of rationalist contempt. The colonial government did not hire Murayama to go practice geomancy or to weaponize magic against Koreans.
They hired him for cultural suppression.
Exactly. They officially classified all of these indigenous beliefs, Pungsujiri, shamanism, intense ancestral worship. They lumped it all together as misinchen.
Superstitions.
And to the colonial mind, these practices were obstacles. They hindered industrial modernization, they drained local resources on things like elaborate funerals, and they fostered resistance.
So his tone in his writing was clinical. It was one of a kind of rationalist superiority.
Very much so. He was studying Korean beliefs to catalog them, to understand where they conflicted with colonial policy, and ultimately to help the administration control and suppress them as obstacles to civilization and development.
That's a really critical distinction. The violence he was serving was rooted in rationalist bureaucracy and technocratic control, not in magic.
Right. But the irony is just profound. Murayama's comprehensive mapping, his cataloging of every major Pungsu site he could find for the purpose of suppression, it inadvertently provided the entire intellectual framework for the myth that came later.
Because he documented the spiritual anatomy so thoroughly.
That when the iron markers were found decades later, he was immediately, and maybe inevitably, accused of having created the strategic map used to drive them in. He made the land legible to both the colonizer and, in a strange twist, to the later mythmaker. So for decades after liberation in 1945, this Iron Stake narrative, it existed mostly as powerful local folklore, but it really hits the national stage, it gets state-sanctioned in the 1990s.
And this era, starting around 1993, this was a huge turning point in South Korean history. It was the end of decades of military authoritarian rule.
And the election of Kim Young-sam, who was the first truly civilian president.
Right, so he had a massive legitimacy problem. He needed to distinguish himself completely from the general presidents who came before him.
And he needed to purify the state of that authoritarian rigidity. This led to him launching the Yoksa Barasogi.
The rectification of history campaign.
Yes, and you can think of it as a form of therapeutic nationalism. It was aimed at healing the deep psychological wounds of the past.
And what were those wounds specifically?
The campaign targeted what they called the twin evils that had burdened the nation. First, the colonial legacy from 1910 to 45, and second, the military dictatorship legacy from 1961 to 93.
And the iron stakes, being these tangible remnants of the deepest colonial wound, they fit perfectly into that framework.
They were perfect. They provided a physical enemy that this new civilian government could go out and symbolically defeat.
But the ultimate symbolic act that really set the stage for the stake hunt wasn't a rod on some remote mountain. It was an enormous building in the capital.
The Japanese Government General Building, the JGGB, a colossal, heavy, neoclassical structure built in 1926.
And its location was everything.
It stood directly in front of the main gate of 𝐏𝐎𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 Palace, which was historically the very core of Korean sovereignty. From a Pengsu perspective, the JGGB was seen as the most egregious blockage of all.
It was physically positioned to interrupt the flow of Kiin, wasn't it?
That's how it was framed. It was called a concrete iron stake, driven into the very heart of Seoul, deliberately blocking the ki that flowed from Mount Bugak down to the old royal palace. Its mere existence was proof of geomantic malice.
And Kim Young-sam ordered its demolition.
He did, and he timed it perfectly with the 50th anniversary of liberation in 1995.
This wasn't a quiet removal. This was a televised national spectacle of state-sponsored healing.
Oh, it was a massive event. It was framed as an act of geomantic liberation. The demolition itself, especially the televised removal of the huge dome and the central spire, it was celebrated across the country as the removal of the ultimate national blockage. It was symbolically freeing the capital's ki.
And the engineering challenge alone must have been immense.
Huge. Taking down this massive structure without damaging the priceless palace grounds right next to it. But the political and spiritual message completely overshadowed any of the technical aspects. And the success of this very visible symbolic action gave him the political momentum and legitimacy he needed to launch the smaller, nationwide physical stake hunt.
So once the symbolic concrete stake was gone, the government officially directed the effort to remove all the presumed smaller splitters.
State endorsement was absolutely key. The Ministry of Home Affairs, local governments, they launched these comprehensive investigations. They mobilized military units, civic groups, mountaineering clubs.
People who actually knew the mountains.
Intimately. And their mission in 1995 was to search the entire length of the Big Dudagon. And news reports at the time claimed hundreds of stakes were found and extracted.
And the removal itself was treated as a kind of therapeutic, ritualistic process.
Very much so. They were healing ceremonies. The extraction of a stake was almost never a silent archaeological dig. It became a media event.
And they would bring in shamans.
Often, yes. Traditional Korean shamanic rituals known as gut were performed. The shamans were there specifically to soothe the wounded earth and appease the mountain spirits.
I read that in many cases they would pour alcohol into the holes.
Yes. Often traditional rice wine. It was a ritual act of disinfection, of cleansing the national wound.
So let's step back a bit and look at the deeper political utility of this myth for the Kim Young-sam administration. Why was the timing so critical in the mid-90s?
Well, the political environment was incredibly volatile, and focusing on this external enemy, this colonial ghost, it had massive benefits. First, it created unity.
How so?
The iron stakes were a unifying symbol that managed to bridge the typically divided political landscape. Anti-imperialist leftists and traditional nationalist conservatives could both agree that removing these stakes was a non-negotiable patriotic duty.
And second, it provided a convenient scapegoat.
Yes. The 1990s were marked by these devastating domestic crises. You had massive structural failures, the 1994 Seongsu Bridge collapse, and then the horrific 1995 Sampoong department store collapse.
Which killed over 500 people.
It was a national trauma, and these events really shook public faith in rapid modernization. They exposed deep internal corruption and systemic failures.
So the Iron Stake myth provided a convenient external spiritual explanation for these internal systemic failures.
Precisely. It refocused national attention away from internal accountability and put it squarely on historical injustice, this lingering curse from the past.
And finally, it bolstered his legitimacy.
It did. By championing this purification, Kim Young-sam positioned himself as this essential figure, the shaman president, who was tasked with spiritually healing the land. It made him fundamentally distinct from the previous military rulers who just relied on force. The stake removal became an essential tool for nation-building in the new democratic era.
Okay, let's move now from the political narrative and the trauma to the cold, hard science. When we forensically analyze the actual physical artifacts they pulled from the ground during that 1995 hunt, what were they? Can we say for sure they were weapons of 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓?
Well, the recovered objects, as they were categorized by local authorities, they showed a lot of consistency. They were mostly iron or steel rods, typically ranging from, say, 30 centimeters up to a meter or even more.
And they were heavily corroded.
Very heavily corroded after decades of exposure. But the durability of the materials themselves, high-grade iron or steel alloys, that's the first clue suggesting an industrial purpose, not a purely magical one.
But the crucial forensic clue, the one that really challenges the curse hypothesis, is the shape of the head, right?
Absolutely. The persistent feature that was reported across numerous extractions was the presence of a hexagonal head. This detail is the smoking gun for the cartography, or at least the utility hypothesis.
Why does a hexagonal head matter so much? I mean, if your intent is spiritual sabotage, a simple sharpened spike is way more menacing.
A hexagonal head is the universal symbol of industrial utility. It implies a precise need for torque.
Torque.
It means the object was designed to be turned by a wrench, a spanner, or an impact tool. It wasn't just meant to be hammered into the earth. It was meant to be screwed into bedrock to achieve maximum tension.
Or to serve as an anchor point for something else.
Even more likely, yes, a bolt upon which something else, like the pace plate of a survey tripod, a tensioning cable for infrastructure, or a signal antenna, would be securely fastened.
So the engineering choice completely undermines the magical intent. It screams stability and functionality, not curse.
That's the forensic conclusion. These objects were anchors, designed to hold serious infrastructure in place. And that realization forces us to acknowledge a much wider range of alternative, mundane origins for these thousands of iron remnants found scattered all over the Korean landscape.
Okay, so we've established the survey markers from the 1910 to 1918 cadastral survey, the class 1, 2, and 3 control points.
Right, but we also have to account for military remnants. Korea has been and still is one of the most intensely militarized landscapes on the entire planet.
And iron stakes and pickets are standard issue.
Standard issue for securing tents, erecting high-gain antennas, reinforcing machine gun emplacements, creating defensive wire obstacles, all at strategic heights. Japanese, U.S., and ROK South Korean forces have all left countless metal remnants in those mountains since 1910.
And we can't forget the colonial mission of resource extraction.
Which points us toward logging and mining anchors. The colonial exploitation of Korea's natural resources was aggressive and required serious engineering.
Like what?
Timber and mineral extraction relied heavily on cableways, tramways, and makeshift rail lines built across these steep, rocky slopes. And those operations required heavy iron loops or bolts drilled deep into rock faces for stabilization and tensioning. Any one of these sources could easily produce the iron stakes they found decades later.
Now here's where the narrative completely destabilizes. It introduces this complication of indigenous practice. The Muan incident of 2010?
The Muan incident. Yeah, this throws the entire theory of it being solely the Japanese into question. In early 2010 in Muan County, and this is not a remote peak, this is a highly sensitive area, ancestral grave sites were found desecrated.
Oh.
Over 378 iron stakes and steel bars had been systematically driven directly into 20 private burial mounds.
And these ancestral graves, these seonsan, they are maybe the most sacred pungsu sites of all. They're essential for the luck of the living descendants.
An intense investigation was launched, and the initial fears naturally focused on a colonial remnant or maybe even North Korean psychological warfare.
But the verdict was shocking.
The verdict from local authorities was that the stakes were attributed not to external intervention, but to local shamans or individuals engaging in indigenous black magic.
Wow. Meaning the motivation was a distinctly Korean shamanic practice used for spiritual warfare against rivals.
Precisely. Driving a stake into a rival's grave is a known and very severe form of Korean shamanic curse. It's an act intended to ruin the descendants' lineage, their fortune, their health. The stakes weren't relics of the past, they were implements of a living, internal spiritual conflict.
So this one incident forces a crucial reevaluation of everything found in 1995.
It does.
If Koreans were actively using iron stakes for spiritual attack in 2010, they were almost certainly doing it in the 1930s, the 50s, the 70s as well.
It introduces this really unsettling possibility of the self-inflicted wound. While blaming all the evil on the foreign invader, externalizing it, served this potent psychological function for national healing and unity, the reality is far more complex.
So the stakes they found in 95 could have been anything.
They could have been Japanese survey markers, U.S. military remnants, logging anchors, or potentially remnants of internal spiritual conflicts, or even acts committed by Korean collaborators, the 𝐏𝐿𝐴, targeting their neighbors under the guise of colonial activity. This reveals a layer of indigenous complexity that the national trauma narrative deliberately overlooks.
Okay, so despite the forensic evidence pointing to surveyors and this complication of indigenous black magic, the Iron Stake myth remains an incredibly potent cultural force.
Oh, absolutely.
And its enduring power was demonstrated spectacularly in 2024 by the massive popularity of this occult film, 𝐏𝐿𝐴.
Or 𝐏𝐿𝐴 in Korean. The film's success confirms that the colonial curse is not some historical footnote. It is a vital, compelling, and emotionally resonant national trope that still speaks very deeply to the Korean public today.
The film's narrative is basically a perfect modern metaphor for the entire myth we've been discussing.
It is. The plot revolves around a family's generational illness, which they trace to a poorly sited ancestral grave located on a sacred myeongdang.
And when the grave is exhumed, there's a twist.
A huge twist. It's revealed that it contains a secondary, much deeper burial, and this burial is intended as a spiritual prison for a powerful Japanese samurai or demon spirit, an oni.
And the key structural metaphor, the thing that ties directly into our deep dive, is the physical arrangement of this spiritual prison.
Exactly. The demon is buried with a massive sword driven vertically right through its body, and this sword is acting as a living iron stake that cuts the waist of the Korean tiger.
So the samurai, even in death, is acting as an agent of 𝐏𝐿𝐴.
The film literally embodies the colonial intent. The foreign enemy, through this physical blockage, is suppressing the national spirit. And the only way to achieve catharsis, to save the family and by extension the nation, is the dramatic physical defeat and removal of this spiritual obstruction.
This enduring power, this absolute resonance with the public, it comes back to that very specific Korean sentiment, Han.
You can't understand the myth's grip without understanding Han. And it's not simple sadness, it's not just anger. Han is this uniquely Korean psychological state of deep-seated, unresolved resentment, grief, and regret that comes from historical injustice and systemic trauma.
And it can be generational, right? A collective weight.
It is often generational, a collective weight carried by the people.
And the iron stake, as a physical metaphor, it perfectly channels this Han.
It's the perfect tangible object for an intangible pain. Han is caused by violence that can't be fully explained or fully avenged. The iron stake gives that violence a physical form, a cold, hard, foreign object lodged deep within the national body, causing this generational suffering.
So the act of removal, the televised extraction of the stake, and the pouring of wine, it offers a satisfying, if symbolic, path towards catharsis.
And the eventual resolution of Han. The myth provides a clear structure for therapeutic healing that politics or economics just can't offer.
So we've navigated the sacred mountains, we've analyzed the bureaucratic mandates, we've witnessed the political drama of the 1990s, and we've examined the forensic evidence. It's clear this story is so much more complicated than just a simple tale of black magic.
It is. So let's try to summarize this duality for the listener. Based on our audit of the sources, the historical reality suggests that the Japanese colonial project was characterized by pervasive violence, economic, cultural, technocratic, but crucially, in the meticulously cataloged archives, there is zero documentary evidence of a centralized magical campaign orchestrated by the government general to specifically target Pengsu veins. The vast majority of these artifacts were mundane infrastructure, triangulation points, military supports, and logging anchors.
The colonial violence was rational and bureaucratic, not magical. But, and I think this is the most critical distinction, to dismiss the stakes as just survey markers is to fundamentally ignore the magnitude of the national trauma.
And that is the cultural reality. The Japanese intent to measure, tax, and control the land bureaucratically was entirely irrelevant to the Korean experience. For the people who watched this happen, people already suffering under colonialism, witnessing the destruction of their communal identity. For them, the act of drilling iron into sacred ground was experienced immediately and viscerally as a profound spiritual violation.
So the iron stake is truly a hybrid object. It's caught between two conflicting truths.
Physically, its characteristics, the hexagonal head, the securing compounds, they confirm it was overwhelmingly a tool of measurement rooted in the cartography imperative.
But metaphysically?
Metaphysically, given the cultural context of colonial violation, it was processed, interpreted, and then weaponized in the public imagination as an agent of spiritual subjugation. It became the curse.
And the ultimate legacy of that 1995 removal campaign, isn't really the success of an archaeological dig.
No.
It's the success of a political and spiritual project. It was a successful act of nation building. It allowed the public a collective, symbolic victory that helps process decades of unresolved grief.
Indeed. The iron stakes are cartography in their origin, but they absolutely became a curse in their reception. They remain a potent symbol of unfinished national business.
And a reminder that while physical boundaries can be redrawn and colonial buildings can be demolished,
And military rule can be overthrown? Yes. But the spiritual geography of a nation, the perceived injuries lodged deep within the collective psyche, those are clearly much, much harder to heal.
thank you for expertly navigating us through the sacred peaks and the bureaucratic mandates of this complex, fascinating history. The Iron Stake is far more than just a piece of rusted metal.
My pleasure. It was a great dive.
So the Iron Stakes remain a powerful thought for you, the listener, to mull over. If a government invests enormous resources in physical, technological surveillance, like a massive land survey, but the population interprets that same effort as a spiritual attack, which reality ultimately holds more power over that nation's future. We'll leave you with that question until next time.